Thank you for joining this conversation. In Breakout Room 1, our topic today, education in the time of COVID-19. No one will disagree that this pandemic has had a direct impact on our students. It has also highlighted some widening achievement gaps between students of color and their counterparts. In this session, we're going to discuss the types of actions that can be taken and what the Biden administration and our congressional leaders are doing to address these gaps. Our moderator today is Candelario Cervantez, National Senior Managing Director, Teach for America. With him on the panel today, Stephen Almazan, a K-12 education program analyst, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. David Hinojosa, Director of Educational Opportunities Project, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And Melissa Lazarin, Senior Advisor for K-12 Policy, Migration Policy Institute. Moderator Cervantes.
Hello, everyone. I'm Candelario Cervantez, he, him, his, and el, and I lead Teach for America's National Latinx Alliances. And I feel so privileged to moderate what I know will be an informative and powerful conversation on education in the time of COVID-19. Join me now in welcoming our panel of amazing Latinx leaders. Melissa Lazarin, our Senior Advisor for K-12 Policy at the Migration Policy Institute. David Hinojosa, Director of Educational Opportunities Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And Stephen Almazan, K-12 Education Program Analyst at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Thank you all so much for taking time to have this conversation with us. This topic is so important to me, not only because this pandemic has disproportionately impacted our Black, Indigenous, people of color communities and has shined a bright light on the inequities impacting our Latinx community, but because it has impacted my family and me directly, because we are the folks that this data is speaking to, which makes it even more personal. Melissa, I would like to start with you, followed by David and Stephen. Please give us your analysis of how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted schools and education. And then can you explain the disparities seen in Native and communities of color?
Sure. Well, let me just preface that this is a really important subject and something that is certainly, we work on issues related to immigrant students and English learners in particular at the K-12 level. And so this has just been a difficult year to watch from the sidelines and but also experience as a parent myself, as probably some of you. So I think, you know, this, as you mentioned, I think the pandemic has exacerbated inequities that we have all known. I think what is been good is that it's helped shine a bigger spotlight on things that we have long known and perhaps propelled some support, both in terms of funding and just more political will to provide, to close some of these access gaps. But you know, for immigrants and English learners, I mean, we're 11 months, 10 months into this pandemic, and we're still hearing from educators and schools that they are not reaching these students. You know, these are students that have, for some reason or another, have become disengaged throughout the process. And of course, our biggest worry is, will we get these students back into the classroom when things do normalize? And what resources will they need once they are back? And what can we be doing in the interim? I think that there's still a lot of questions. Educators still have a lot of questions. And there is still a great lack of support and expertise that, you know, and they need these supports now.
Thank you so much, David. I would love your insights or thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's been incredibly challenging, especially in light of the cry out for racial justice that's been going on during this same period of time, primarily for the Black community, of course, but other communities, the Indigenous community, the Latinx community has also both partnered with and highlighted the gross injustices that they've suffered. And now we have this huge public educational system that has been impacted by the pandemic. It has magnified, as Melissa was sharing, magnified the inequities. There was already an existing homework gap, the digital gap, where you could, be able to do your homework. Public libraries, closed at a certain time. Now, all of a sudden, they weren't open at all. Students have problems, with connectivity, with bandwidth, with hardware itself. And it's really impacted, students and communities. But on top of that also is the incredible suffering that has gone on with many of the families who have been disproportionately impacted, families of color who have been disproportionately impacted, 4 times the infection rates, 3 times more likely to die, from COVID than white students for the Latinx community. And you're talking about, this, the daily losses in learning, that are being experienced, but also the mental health and the psychological well-being that is being impacted for many communities of color, especially those who are already, distressed with poverty challenges and the like. So it's brought, some incredible challenges. I don't think the government has been as responsive as it can, and we'll talk about, the hope that lies, in front of us. But it's just been incredibly distressing, and I can't even imagine, those families that are most impacted, with lack of access to healthcare, that are facing, immigration issues with their families and the like.
Thank you, David. Stephen, if you would please share your thoughts as well.
Thank you, Candelario. And Melissa and David have highlighted a lot of areas that have really been exacerbated. But one thing to note is that the long-term closures of early childhood settings, K-12 schools, college campuses, which have been necessary to protect the safety and health of communities, have significantly exacerbated longstanding inequities in our educational system. A recent analysis on the effects of learning loss estimates that students on average could lose 5 to 9 months of learning by the end of June 2021. But when looking into the details of the numbers, Black students may fall behind by 10 months, Latinx students may fall behind by 9 months, and low-income students may fall behind by over a year in comparison with 4 to 8 months for white students. And another study estimates that as many as 3 million students have not received any formal education, virtual or in person, since March 2020, which is absolutely devastating. And Melissa shared this, but just really highlighting when looking at the disparities for English learners, despite educators' best efforts during this crisis, it is proving difficult to provide high quality online instruction for English learners due to lack of electronic devices, connectivity, digital curricula, specifically designed for English learners, and teacher training for online instruction. And lastly, the pandemic has also illuminated the impact of the historic and continuous gross underfunding of IDEA, and the great strain that this underfunding places on state and local education systems. There definitely needs to be more support to help make virtual learning more accessible for students with learning disabilities, for students with students who are English learners. So without significant federal assistance, cuts to state education budgets this year and well into the future, due to significant declines in state revenues, and additional COVID-19 related costs will only further exacerbate these inequities.
Thank you all so much for elevating all these issues that we've been, like I said, shine a bright light on, right? I think what we've been hearing, like going back to normal, is like, can't wait to go back to normal. Like, actually, no, going back to normal has never been good enough for our students. Like, actually, we don't need to do that, and we need to rethink. So Melissa and Stephen, I would love your thoughts on this question and build on some of the things that y'all highlighted, specifically around our linguistically diverse students. And I also elevate like our students with disabilities in this space. Like, what are the biggest challenges in K-12 education regarding remote learning? What advice do you have for our parents and caregivers to ensure our children don't fall behind in this remote and distant learning environment?
Sure. Well, certainly, I think the issue that has been highlighted the most is access to digital devices and connectivity. That is certainly been, I think that has really surfaced to the top of the stack. And I think there has been some progress. Certainly, states and districts have, especially during the summer, made a lot of effort to try to get devices into the hands of families that didn't have that. But there's still, connectivity in particular, I think continues to be a major problem. And I think we have to, I think particularly in households that have multiple children, the bandwidth is just simply not enough. And I think, so that's one. And I think second is, in general, a big challenge for families, and particularly the families we're talking about, is creating a space at home that is conducive to remote learning. And that is for a variety of reasons. It could be multiple children. It could be, these disproportionately immigrants are representative in jobs that are considered essential. So mom and dad might not be at home to be able to support home learning. And this falls in, sometimes on the shoulders of older siblings who may have to put their own studies aside to make sure their younger siblings are being supported, are getting the care that they need. So this is, as David alluded to, just sort of the social and emotional needs that are weighing on top of the shoulders of these young people is really incredible. And I think third, a big challenge that we are wrestling with is how to measure the impact and of the pandemic and of not being in school, whether in person or how we measure that in terms, not just academic, but the social emotional language for English learners. Some of their only exposure is to English and is in school. So what does it mean to not have those opportunities to practice as much as they have been their English skills?
Thank you so much, Melissa. Stephen, I'd love your thoughts and for you to build on, like, how is it that we have millions of children that have not have access to education, like even now?
Yeah, and just to add on to Melissa, the COVID-19 pandemic caused a near total shutdown of the U.S. school system, forcing more than 55 million students to transition to home-based remote learning practically overnight. And obviously going through this for months and almost up to a year now, in most cases, that has meant logging into online classes and accessing lessons and assignments through a home internet connection, which we know is now often reliable and steady, as Melissa shared earlier. But looking into the details, for 1 out of 3 Black, Latino, and Native households, that was not an option. Nationwide, across all racial and ethnic groups, 16.9 million children remain locked out from instruction because their families lack the home internet access necessary to support online learning. Most of the burden for equipping students with devices and internet access for ongoing learning have fallen to schools, districts, and states, but in reality, it has fallen on our families as well. But they cannot resolve the existing disparities alone. Bringing high-speed home internet access to all 8.4 million households that currently are offline will require leadership at the federal level to approve additional funding to support students' learning needs. And schools, districts, and states also need funding for necessary infrastructure for long-term expansion of broadband access to support synchronous learning, especially in rural communities of color. And you asked us earlier, Candelario, about parents and guardians who have limited English proficiency and who have a disability may need additional support or accommodations to meaningfully communicate with their child's school. I mean, during this time, communication and transparency is absolutely necessary to ensure that students are receiving the resources and access and instructional learning or the instruction that they need to learn. So at the federal level, leadership should provide resources that assist schools and districts in meeting these ongoing legal obligations and help to ensure that information about the availability of school meals, the process of participating in distance learning, and any other vital information that should be available to all families.
Thank you. David, I actually wanted to ask you more, since you elevated the need of the digital divide, right? I know in some of our schools, like the ability for us to solve this quickly has been top of mind since the onset of the pandemic, like getting devices into our children's hands. And I think we've also seen data where, because we've been able to provide those hotspots or give access to families, not only has our children been able to do their virtual learning, but it also has helped to move our households forward. Like our caregivers that may have not been able to apply for jobs online now have access to do that, right? To apply for online. So I was just wondering, could you elevate or highlight some more, speak more on this?
Sure, and I think, we often talk of things in kind of monoliths, right? So we talk about the Latinx community or the BIPOC community as though, they all have the, same access to resources and the like. But as Melissa was suggesting earlier, some families, have had access, before the pandemic and continue to have access. Our family, here we have, plenty of, different computers that we've been able to use to help support the education of our children and the like. No real problems with broadband bandwidth, sorry. And so, while schools have been reactive to this issue in part by, for example, creating hotspots in school buses, and so you have seen, these hopeful yet tragic pictures of, all these families in their cars, sitting there doing their homework. They can only do their homework to a certain hour as the daylight, passes, or their batteries on their cars have been, running out while they've been trying to use that light to help them with their homework as they've been trying to do that. Some people haven't had access to computers, haven't had access to connectivity. And so their only access to schoolwork has been through, when they've been a part of remote learning, has been through homework packets. So you go to school, you drive up, you get your homework packet, for a few different days on a few subjects. If you have questions, the teachers might be available, at certain hours that you yourself might not be available, and or there might not be the language support for some of the families to help with the translation in getting certain questions answered. So I just think that some of these issues have been piling up. I do think that with some progress being made by some schools purchasing iPads or different laptops, Chromebooks and the like, giving those families, access where they never had access, before. I think one study had shown that, we've gone from 16 million, a recent study by the Southern Education Foundation showed that we've gone from 16 million to 12 million students, without the digital tools themselves. And, that's still incredibly distressing, because you're still talking about roughly 1 out of every 4 children that doesn't have access to those quote unquote new essential learning tools. And I think it's going to take considerable action. We always, tend to focus on, the federal government, but the federal government typically only provides 10% of funding for education. This is going to have to be a priority for the states. And we're not necessarily seeing that. We're seeing federal funding coming in and states replacing their own funding losses with that revenue. So you're not putting people, in a better situation. You're just trying to use that, as a stopgap measure. But I think, when it comes to, the digital learning, and I think schools have tried to be as creative as they can with some of the resources that they've had access to, but it still remains incredibly challenging, especially for rural communities that we haven't talked a lot about today. So rural communities have been terribly impacted because they already suffered, with access to the internet itself, let alone, the bandwidth problems, that some people, have experienced. And so they've had to resort to even more, drastic measures and or being forced to open their schools with not the safest conditions because we have problems, with the buildings themselves. So even when you try to suggest, well, what are the options going from remote learning to in-school building, and those are compounded by the health problems, that we discussed, especially for people of color who have been impacted, even more today. So I think, it's going to take some creativity. At bottom, I think that that this whole pandemic and the crisis has shown how incredibly important access to digital learning is, not just for the pandemic, but beyond. And access needs to be known as kind of like that fourth utility now. It has to be protected, like access to water, access to electricity. And unless we have those protections built out, at the federal level and state level, we might just find ourselves in this same predicament or even worse should, another crisis hit our country.
Thank you so much for elevating that. I think something that we were talking about, I like how you said new. This is our new pen and paper, right? These are the tools that are necessary for our students to excel and succeed in this new environment, this new world, right? So I'm so happy that you elevated this, especially the need in our rural communities, which is constantly, I feel like we're not speaking enough about. Melissa, I would also like to come back to you because I did highlight these are personal issues, right? Because this is our families, this is impacting our communities. What advice would you give to caregivers or parents that you think would be helpful as you yourself are navigating this?
Yeah, I mean, as David also said, I believe I'm definitely our family's one of the lucky ones where, I'm not worried about ours or my kids, but, I think that we do have to remember that parents are always, the most, one of the most important influences and educators in our children's lives. I think reading, in whatever language and just talking to your children. I think at this point, a lot of these kids and children, this far along into the pandemic, we just need to keep the lines of communication open with our kids and focus on their emotional, how they're doing. And, I think at the end of the day, I mean, parents are doing the best they can. We really need to help our educators and schools, make sure that they know how to keep the lines of how to, keep the communication going with parents and students, and in these difficult times, and that it might involve, more telephone calls. Maybe it's WhatsApp messages or Facebook messaging. I think we have to get creative and really think about the medium and communication that parents and families are using right now, and depend on. And this is really, this is the time to do those things.
David, do you have any advice from your vantage point?
Yeah, I think family engagement has always been a critical tool for Latinx and other people of color, their communities, to better engage, with their schools, because schools, the way that they've operated, kind of haven't included, not to say that they've purposefully excluded communities of color, but they have, operated not, as inclusive as they could. And now this has, again, brought so many different challenges, the different meetings that were set up previously, the cafecitos, that many schools, had created for parents. Those aren't there anymore. Maybe some have transferred those, to social media and have had their own cafecitos while they're, online. But those of us that have participated in those types of things know it's still not, that, level of engagement. So, we're going to, find ourselves, in a new process and trying to adapt, because, we've been given mixed messages from the federal government, frankly, and many of us in our different states have received, mixed messages about how and when, the extent of this pandemic and the like. So we've kept on trying to look, over the horizon, and it keeps changing, and it keeps going further and further down the line. And for families, themselves, they must be, incredibly frustrated by this. But hopefully with, an injection of additional funds, at least, going into the next year, schools will continue to try and be, more creative and engage, more specific outreach for underserved communities of color. But, parents are trying to put food on the table. They're trying to keep their jobs. When they have to go to the emergency room, for healthcare, that takes up, a considerable amount of time as well. And so their time and expense, and the mental impact of this is just, it's astronomical. It's nothing that you think that policy itself can fix. And how and try, and the need for parents to be, the number one advocate for their child, while also trying to address all of these emergency situations that continue to pop up. They're often the frontline workers, in, the essential workers. That's where they're working at, putting themselves at even, greater danger, and then putting their families at greater risk. But, they're going to have to do their best, and stay in the course, as Melissa shared, trying to keep, constant contact without overwhelming teachers. Because, now it's not just, 26 parents, sets of parents, that you might be assisting, but it might be, so many different emails, from the same parent, as those avenues of communication have opened up, which is a good thing, but it also might be overwhelming from the parent side. So just trying to be better partners in different ways, as Melissa's mentioned, I think is the best thing, that parents can do.
Thank you all so much. I love the focus here on our parents and caregivers. And I think also like our educators, like I always say, our educators are doing heroic things in this moment. And they themselves are having to, educate their own kids and families and navigating these systems. So I'm so happy that we elevated these voices. And I also love that you all talked to write a policy and legislation. So let's dive in there a little bit deeper. Stephen, I'm going to start with you. What pending or upcoming legislation is intended to address the challenges are facing now? And what is the outlook in Congress? Is there any hope of bipartisan work on education?
Yeah, as I think it's important to note that as decisions are made about how to distribute much needed supplemental funds to families, educators, schools, and communities, Congress should prioritize children and families facing the greatest barriers to their educational success. Prior to the COVID-19 public health crisis, public schools in the US were among the most inequitably funded of any in the industrialized world. And state and local education funds were routinely used in ways that provided greater funding to school districts with a higher concentration of white children than children of color. And similar disparities can be seen in higher education as well, with states and the federal government sending more funding to predominantly white institutions than historically Black colleges and universities and minority serving institutions. So urgency and simplicity in aid distribution should not be used as a justification for reinforcing longstanding inequities or allowing federal aid to displace funds owed to students by their state and community. There must be a clear mandate from federal leadership to prioritize low-income students, students of color, Native students, English learners, and other marginalized students, and to include students in all supports without regard to their immigration status, their identity as an LGBTQ person, or their status as a justice impacted person. And additionally, the formula for distributing aid to institutions of higher education should also target low wealth public and nonprofit institutions with high enrollments of low income students, taking into account institutions that may have low Pell participation, even though they have a large share of low income students. But just in terms of hope of what can be done, like at the end of the day, there is no reason that civil rights should be a partisan issue. We are with civil rights, and we will continue to work to transform public education so that all young people can attend safe, inclusive, and resource schools that prepare them for successful futures.
I love that you said that civil rights is not it's not a political issue. I mean, it's bipartisan. So I love that. Melissa, please share us your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that Stephen hit all the important pieces. I would just add that, you know, a lot of the funding, in particular, the relief funding, is going to states in, you know, through a Title I funding. So it is, you know, it is targeting schools that need it most. But I think this is an opportunity for states and advocates to really weigh in, because aside from that, there's a lot of flexibility in how those dollars can be applied. And, you know, and for some of the students that, you know, English learners, for example, you know, it's about preserving those EL teachers, making sure, you know, family and community engagement specialists, you know, we realize that states are in a really hard spot in terms of budgeting. If they're, you know, decisions will have to be made. We need to make sure that we are preserving funding for the students that need it most, and the educators and staff that are there to support these students. You know, so that is something I think is important. And I would just also, you know, I think it is concerning that the relief bills have sidestepped undocumented workers. There's huge implications for our families that are mixed status, and you know, I think that is an important thing. It's a huge oversight, but also something that we as states and advocates and community-based organizations, it will be upon us to help fill those gaps.
I was wondering also, I know we elevated at the federal level, but what can we also do at the state level? As we know, a lot of education policy is controlled at a state level. What are your thoughts there, Melissa? And then David, I would love to build on that.
Sure. I mean, again, states are going to be important actors in determining where those dollars go, as well as at the district level and school board level. So I think, you know, I am hopeful that they will look at, they will consider all the data, all the research before them, and make smart decisions about where that funding goes, and really look at the needs of the community.
Thank you, Melissa. David?
Yeah, I think, the focus on states, especially, for LULAC members, I've worked with Texas LULAC, I've worked with Florida LULAC and many other LULAC state chapters on trying to address, these issues at the state level, because like you said, most of the educational policy is controlled and directed by the state policymakers. And it remains, incredibly important, because that's where the brunt of the lack of access to equal educational opportunity results from. So we know from, several studies that in many states, including Texas and New York and among other states. So it's not, just your more progressive states or your more conservative states, it's also some progressive states that that opportunity gaps remain incredibly large between high minority school and school districts compared to low minority schools and school districts. So you have, over between $1,000 and $2,000 difference per child that a school receives, not for any reason in the classroom, but simply because of politics. And those inequities are going to continue, in spite of, the federal stimulus funds that are intended to reach, those children in the highest needs schools. And it's imperative, that, communities, including, LULAC, among, several others, teachers and the like, come together to try and resolve, those issues once and for all. So some of the states will have to relook at, what sources of income they principally rely upon to fund education. They're going to have to look at how they disperse the funds, because when you have state cuts, if you are a poor district, you're likely receiving a larger share of your money from the state as opposed to local property taxes, if that's the way your schools are funded. So when there are state cuts, who's suffering most from those cuts? It's the highest need schools and school districts and school children that are receiving, the biggest cuts in those. And those cuts in education, although money itself doesn't resolve everything, it does help you purchase better teachers, better training for teachers. It helps you recruit and retain a more diverse workforce. It helps you build the competency, the cultural competency of those teachers and the like. It allows you to offer a more extended selection of rigorous and relevant coursework. It allows you to offer, full day, high quality pre-K, extracurricular activities. It goes on and on. There is a connection between funding and opportunity. And so it's imperative that, communities try and influence that the state policies, not just with the federal funding that's going to come in. So it's important to make sure that those federal funds do reach those highest need schools and school children. That's, incredibly important. But for the long game, there are certain structural changes that will need to be made to ensure that more equitable funding, results, from the actions of state policymakers. So again, that's part of the issue. There's also an issue related to higher education that we haven't really talked about much. That we have colleges that have been hit hard with losses of tuition, losses of state revenue, fewer services, possibly higher tuition that they're looking at. And we have a dip in the high minority schools. One study has shown where enrollment has dipped 26% college enrollment, just over the last year. And so, a focus is going to have to be on being able to support those students also. Hopefully we'll get some relief with student debt, at the federal level, and not just a stopgap measure, but possibly also the passing of the College Affordability Act and the like. It's a continuum, between whether you're going to refer to it as K-16 or K-20. Attention needs to be made because education is incredibly important when it comes to opportunity and advancement in America.
Thank you, David, so much for shedding light on this. I think this is something that I've been elevating. Our communities have done so much work to ensure that our Latinx community is going to college, and we saw increasing of our students going to college, right? And I think the other conversation there was like the persistence rate. Like, yes, they're going to higher rates, but how are they continuing to stay and finish college, right? Has been the other topic. But one thing I have also been elevating is like our students are still applying to go to college, right? And they still need to pay for college. So what are the resources out there to ensure that they can still move? And one resource I'd love to highlight is one from our partner, Immigrant Rising. They've been submitting and sharing out scholarships for undocumented and documented folks, Latinx folks, to apply for, right? Which is also another of our communities that, don't have access to these funds. So thank you for elevating this. Stephen, I'm going to come to you with this next question. One of our amazing AAPI executives, Sarah Hall, always elevates, data has the power to reveal and data has the power to conceal. So do you have any advice where our community members can get data that they can use in their advocacy that can highlight this work? I think it's just so important that our folks know where we can get this. Of course, LULAC, we provide different sorts of data, but are there others?
Yeah, no, most definitely. Thank you for that question, Candelario. I think it's absolutely important that folks on the ground are able to access data that's relevant to their own school and their own community. So trying to see if there are any ways that they can access data through the local school district or through their state education department for advocates and for community members who are looking for more broad data and more expansive data. I would very much look into the civil rights data collection offered through the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, just to see what specific ways in which there are still obviously significant gaps in understanding what is actually happening on the ground in our schools. But I would very much start at the local level, at the state level, and make it very certain, because if there is not data transparency and if there is not enough information to connect with the stories and with what is happening in their school sites and in the communities, I think it's important to elevate it and attach that to any advocacy that they may be doing. I always push for moving hearts and minds, right? Like you want to make sure that you're able to elevate your own story and how it impacts, but understanding that there are a lot of disparities that exist and that will unfortunately continue to exist if we don't highlight and where we can allocate resources where it's needed most. And I think that's an important piece to understanding and having access to data.
Thank you, Stephen. And as we're wrapping up our conversation, given how LULAC, we like to take action and lead the way when it comes to advocating for educational equity and excellence, what is one thing our community members need to be uplifting when we're meeting with members of Congress, local officials, school board members, et cetera? I always personally like to elevate the importance of teacher diversity, knowing that only 8% of our teachers identify as Latinx and less than 7% our principals, right? Yet, 25% of our students identify as Latinx. What are those what is the one thing, if our members walk away with, what is that thing that you want them to uplift when they're meeting with our members or policymakers? And Melissa, I'd love to start with you.
Oh, it's hard to pick just one. I agree. Educators are the backbone of our school system. I think for me, if I had to pick one, it would probably be funding, and I think that is very, unfortunately, the way it is a very state and local issue, and that is where parents and communities can probably help really influence what happens. I think those decisions are really locally made, much more than many people expect. That's where the majority of funding for schools comes from. So that's probably where I would ask parents to weigh in.
David.
Well, I am often known as a school finance litigator. So I would say, funding, but since Melissa's highlighted that, there's so many different issues, from school integration to counseling, more counseling, and not, criminalizing behavior, of students, to, again, access, and completion, in college. So after saying those, I'll now abide by your instructions to state one thing. And I think that's, building a much more culturally competent, unbiased, and diverse teaching workforce. Our schools, many communities are still, separated from the people who are teaching them, day to day. They don't understand, their issues. They look at their certain characteristics of the communities that they're teaching in through a very heavy deficit lens. And I know this because I've been a director of an equity assistance center where I've provided training, all across, the South in schools directly with teachers and school administrators. And I know that there are huge deficits between, mindset deficits as well. But these can also, be shaped, by different training. It needs to be deep-rooted training. It needs to be training, at the colleges and universities also, and through the other alternative training programs that are out there, so that they can see communities and families that they're serving through a much more kinder and gentler and progressive lens that they need to. But I do think that building a more culturally competent, diverse workforce is essential, for the long term that parents and communities need to, address.
Thank you, David. Stephen, what is your one thing?
I was going to hop on the funding train, but just to be just stray away from that. But I think it's important to uplift policies and advance policies that provide safe, healthy, and inclusive school climates, specifically around reducing exclusionary school discipline practices and eliminating racial disparities in school discipline. And it's important to note when going back to school in person, when it is safe to do so, health-wise, a lot of students are also thinking, in addition to being safe in going back to school, what does that mean in terms of socio-emotional needs? What does it mean in terms of having more counselors? What does it mean to ensure that there is an environment that ensures that they are meeting the needs of students. So I think it's really, really important that we uplift what does it actually mean to have safe, healthy, and inclusive school climates, especially in this climate, in the virtual setting, but also when going back into school.
Thank y'all so much. I always like to end on this hopeful note. So finally, final question. What do you find hopeful in this new Biden-Harris administration? And for me, I'm gonna name Dr. Cardona. That was my 1 sense. Melissa.
I'm lucky that you always go to me first. I'm full pick. But actually, you named mine as well. I am extremely excited about what it means to have a former English learner, a Latino, and leading our education department, and what that means for our community. I think I'm very hopeful about that. I'm also in general hopeful that I think the fact that the administration in general, Joe Biden has very strong connections to educators and to higher education. I think all of that is certainly leaves me a lot more hopeful than I've been in a long time.
David.
I think it's, the Biden administration's focus on racial justice and civil rights. I think, with many of the appointments that he's had, in that field, where he's anticipating, from the Attorney General through, some of the DOJ appointments that have been made, I remain most helpful for that. We've already seen him issuing executive orders, that basically take down other executive orders put in by the Trump administration that had targeted, issues such as, raising a focus on, implicit bias and, our sordid history of racial and ethnic discrimination, across this country. So I remain, especially hopeful there. And it includes the appointment of Dr. Cardona also. I remain hopeful that Dr. Cardona will listen to the LULAC community and other communities and not rush, although we have highlighted some of the significant problems in day-to-day learning, from remote learning and hybrid models. I also hope we don't rush to judgment and force those families into schools that might not be ready and safe. And that includes, for the testing of English language proficiency, where, people are like, well, they need to be tested. Unfortunately, some of those testing companies haven't offered, remote testing, but so they're saying, well, we're going to put you into schools that have already been determined not to be safe and ready for you. But so, these rush to judgments, certainly we want children and families to be able to return to school. We want to make sure that it's done safely. So I remain, hopeful that Dr. Cardona will listen, to us and at least, make sure that students, are evaluated, appropriately, but also safely and at the right time, and will issue the appropriate guidance when necessary.
Thank you, David. Stephen, you have the final word.
I think it's just really important to note that with this administration, with any administration, the focus should be around sustaining civil rights protections in the U.S. Department of Education. And I said it earlier, but there's no reason that civil rights should be a partisan issue. And we're looking forward to continuing to advance the work that so many of our communities that Melissa and David have uplifted in this current administration and in the 117th Congress.
Thank you all so much for your time and for sharing your voices and elevating the voices of our community. I just can't tell you how much I appreciate all the work that you all are doing. Community members, please find our bio information on LULAC's website and connect with us and see how you can help us push our work forward. But thank you all so much. I promised it was going to be an informative and powerful conversation. I hope we delivered. Thank you all again. I'm going to turn it back over to our Master of Ceremonies, David Cruz.